The sun blazed mercilessly over crimson Mesa, turning the red stone into something that looked like molten iron. Heat shimmered off the ridges in dancing waves, distorting everything beyond them into liquid mirages. Down below, expensive trucks idled in neat rows while men in pristine tactical gear laughed loud enough to carry over the desert wind. Rachel stepped out of her weathered pickup truck, its faded paint telling stories of countless miles through unforgiving terrain. Her boots sank into the rust-colored soil as she surveyed the scene before her. A cloth-wrapped rangefinder hung from her weathered hand, its casing scratched and dulled from years of faithful service. Her field jacket was sun-bleached and worn. Soft at the seams, the kind of gear that spoke of experience rather than expense. No one looked her way as she made her entrance. A man unloading a stack of spotting scopes bumped into her without so much as an apology, his eyes fixed on his gleaming equipment. Another shooter, already positioned behind his rifle, muttered something under his breath about sand fleas, loud enough for her to hear.
Rachel didn't react. She'd heard worse. The shooters lined up along the concrete firing line like peacocks displaying their plumage. Their gear was pristine, their scopes polished to mirror brightness, and their voices full of the kind of confidence that grows in closed circles. One of them glanced in her direction and smirked, nudging his partner with an elbow. "She's here to carry clipboards," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. Rachel kept walking, her head turning slightly, as if listening to something only she could hear. Dust swirled at her heels as she made her way to the far edge of the range, where a small top flapped against its frame, shading a folding chair and a rusted crate. She set her bag down there. No welcome, no briefing, just the vast openness of the desert and the low metallic groan of steel targets swaying in the wind. She sat in silence, her hand resting on the rangefinder like it was breathing with her. The sun climbed higher, dragging heat like a curtain over the landscape. Mirage bent the horizon, making distant targets shimmer like ghosts. Sand kicked up in brief whirlwinds, stinging eyes and finding its way into every crease of fabric. Around her, the saguaro cacti swayed subtly, unmoved by the noise or the tension gathering across the firing line. Beneath the warped light, everything felt slightly unreal. Everything except her stillness. While others fidgeted with their equipment and adjusted their positions, Rachel remained motionless, reading the desert like a book written in wind and shadow. The atmosphere on the range was thick with unspoken hierarchy. These men had come to prove they belonged among the elite, and they weren't about to let some unknown woman with worn gear disrupt their carefully maintained pecking order. But as Rachel sat beneath her makeshift shelter, watching the cactus, arms sway in patterns invisible to others, something told her this day would be different from what anyone expected. The wind whispered secrets across the mesa, and for the first time in a long while, Rachel smiled. Just barely, just enough for the desert to notice. Sergeant Cain's voice cut through the morning air like gravel dragged across concrete. He called out names with clipped efficiency, pointing toward assigned benches and lanes with the disinterested precision of a man who'd done this 1,000 times before. His uniform was crisp despite the desert heat, and his eyes held the kind of coldness that came from years of watching people fail. When he reached Rachel's name, he barely glanced up from his clipboard. "You're with Travis. Just call Wind. Nothing fancy." He turned before she could reply, already barking orders at someone else, dismissing her presence like she was part of the scenery. Travis was young, probably not much older than 20, and looked like he was already regretting volunteering for whatever had brought him here. His gear didn't quite fit right, his gloves were too stiff, and his breathing was shallow as he set up at the lane farthest from the main group. The isolation wasn't accidental. It was a message. He tried to smile at Rachel, awkward and apologetic. "I guess I'm the lucky one," he said, then winced at his own words. She nodded once, no judgment in her expression. Around them, the firing line buzzed with the ritual noise of elite shooters preparing to prove they belonged. Scopes clicked into position, magazines slapped home with authority, jackets stretched over clean uniforms marked with sponsor patches that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Someone leaned back from lane 5 and smirked in their direction. "Look at that! Pair, daycare lane," he called out.
loud enough for everyone to hear. Another voice joined in. "Hey, clipboard girl! You taking orders or just making weather art?" Rachel said nothing. The clipboard she'd been handed was cracked at the spine, the kind of throwaway tool meant to make her feel disposable. She held it anyway, steady and clean, writing nothing yet. Her eyes scanned the landscape, reading each cactus, each wind shift between the gullies, seeing what others couldn't. The first shots began echoing downrange, one by one. They missed. The steel. Targets remained silent, defiant against the expensive ammunition being thrown at them. Wind gusted from the west, then dropped, then rose from the canyon floor, unpredictable and dry. A veteran shooter cursed and reset his scope. "Mirage is crap. Nothing's holding." Another followed with, "Must be her bad luck soaking into the dirt." At lane 3, a shooter slammed his rifle on the rest with frustration. "Hey, spotter girl, mind standing downwind next time?" Laughter followed, low and vicious, the kind that left marks on the soul. Cain walked past Rachel without pause, his eyes already on the next shooter. He didn't correct the comments, didn't acknowledge the growing hostility. His silence was permission, and everyone knew it. Rachel adjusted her seat slightly under the tarp, shifting to block the sun from Travis's sightline. Her voice remained silent, but her focus never wavered. Travis fumbled with his bolt, his hands uncertain. "They're just loud," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "You don't have to—" She lifted a hand gently, stopping him. Her focus was on the air again, watching the heat bend along the ridgeline. A cactus near the 800-meter mark listed to the left, its ribs aligned perfectly with a narrow crosswind threading between stone outcrops. She watched it like it held secrets. The wind said everything to those who knew how to listen. And Rachel had been listening to the desert's voice for longer than most of these men had been shooting. A sharp whistle cut through the range as one of the shooters flipped a coin onto the ground near her boot. "Call it! Heads she's real, tails she's just a mirage." But Rachel's gaze had already drifted to a far cactus at the edge of the range. Its arms bent like it was shrugging at the nonsense behind it. Behind her glasses, her eyes narrowed slightly. She made no sound, but something in her posture shifted, like a cat preparing to pounce. The desert was about to teach these men a lesson they'd never forget. The mockery continued like a steady drumbeat. Practice casings clinked at Rachel's feet, tossed with theatrical precision by shooters who found their entertainment in her silence. One landed near her boot and rolled away with a metallic whisper against stone. "You forgot your round, sweetheart," someone called out, followed by snickers that carried on the hot wind. Travis glanced toward Rachel, unsure if he should intervene. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. He was young, inexperienced, and paired with the woman everyone had already written off. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his rifle, the pressure of performing under hostile eyes making everything feel impossible. Lane 6 fired and missed again. The shooter slapped his magazine against his thigh in frustration. "This wind is garbage," he growled. "Or maybe your spotter's off eating cactus," came the reply. "At least that one doesn't talk back." Rachel's gaze drifted toward a far cactus at the edge of the range, its arms positioned like a weather vane reading the desert's mood. Behind her glasses, her eyes narrowed slightly, but she made no sound. The cracked clipboard rested against her leg like a shield, protecting something precious that none of them could see. A few instructors gathered near the shade tent, sipping coffee from silver thermoses and watching her from behind polarized lenses. Their conversation was muted but pointed. "Why did Cain even assign her?" one asked. The other shrugged. "Backup spotter, optics assistant or something, probably some hobbyist with a good GPA." They chuckled, dismissive, already writing the day's narrative in their minds, but their eyes kept drifting back to her tarp, something nagging at the edges of their awareness. Travis finally got set up and looked over his shoulder, speaking carefully. You want to call the wind?" Rachel nodded once. When her voice came, it was low and calm, cutting through the chaos like a blade through silk. 9 o'clock. Full hold. Drop a half." Travis did as she said, nervous fingers tightening on the rifle. He didn't fire yet. Something in her tone told him to wait. The wind shifted again, small dust devils skipping across the range like dancers. Her hand lifted slightly. "Quarter left. Send." Her tone didn't change, and neither did her face. Travis breathed in and squeezed the trigger. The steel remained quiet. He had missed. "Sorry," he exhaled, defeat already creeping into his voice. Rachel cut him off with a small shake of her head, her eyes already watching the cactus arms again. The mirage was thickening, and behind them more jokes flew like arrows. "Must be tough being the only spotter here without a shot record." "She's using astrology, you think? Moon's in retrograde. Better dial left." But Rachel was no longer listening to them. She tilted her head, scanning the rocks to the west, where the wind bent a patch of dry grass into a perfect indicator. She adjusted her clipboard, making a small mark with her finger. 8 o'clock, she said quietly. "Hold even." No one heard her but Travis. He tried again, his trust beginning to build despite his fear. The rifle bucked gently in his hands, and in the distance there was a faint ring, sharp and clean. A steel target sang back at them, its voice cutting across the desert like a bell announcing the arrival of something unexpected. Silence followed. The men up the line turned slightly, confusion rippling through their ranks. One muttered, "Luck." Rachel lowered the clipboard into her lap as a breeze pushed the tarp's edge into her shoulder, the cactus just beyond the 900-meter. Line leaned, unmoved, dust curling behind it, rising and fading like smoke signals. She still wasn't smiling, but she was watching everything. And for the first time since she'd arrived, the desert felt like it was watching back. The game had just begun, and the rules were about to change completely. Heat settled into something heavier now, clinging to the ground like a second skin. Mirage rolled off the sand in waves, warping the outline of the 600-meter steel target until it looked like it was breathing. Beyond it, cactus silhouettes stood sentinel against the rust-colored earth, their shadows sharp and long. Everything hummed quietly, like the range was holding its breath. Travis wiped his palms on his pants and adjusted his grip on the rifle. The barrel pointed downrange, steady but uncertain. He glanced at Rachel once, hesitant, but she was already watching the wind with the intensity of someone reading sacred text. Her hand rested on the edge of her clipboard, thumb marking calculations scratched in faded pencil, notes from battles fought long before today. "Hold 2, quarter breath. Send." Her voice cut through the stillness, calm and exact. Travis exhaled and pulled the trigger. The rifle cracked, and a second later the steel target pinged high and clean, like a bell cutting across the heat. A few heads turned down the line. Someone lowered binoculars. No one said anything, but the silence had weight now. Rachel watched the cactus just to the right of the next target, its arms tilting slightly as shadows shortened with a shifting breeze. She called again, 1.8, slight left, send. Another shot. Another ring. Travis blinked, surprised. His posture changed. Not cocky, just anchored. He studied the rifle with new eyes. "Call it," he said quietly, and she did. Her instructions came in short, measured tones. She never repeated herself, never looked away from the range, never doubted. Another shot. Ping! Again! Ping! Every round found steel with mechanical precision. Across the firing line, the tone began to change. No more jokes, no more tossed shells or fake whispers. The shooters were quieter now, adjusting scopes, resetting positions. A few glanced sideways with expressions that had shifted from amusement to something approaching concern. One instructor lowered his spotting scope and looked directly at Rachel, his expression unreadable behind wraparound sunglasses. Travis breathed easier now. His hands no longer shook when he loaded the next round. Each time she spoke, his movement matched her rhythm like they were dancing to music only they could hear. "Hold breath. Send." The steel replied with that same clean tone, clear and irrefutable. She didn't react to the sound, didn't lean forward or tighten her jaw. Her face remained neutral, her posture loose under the tarp, as dust lifted around her boots. She watched the cactus at 700 meters now, tracking the way it shifted in the light, how its shadow bent and revealed the wind's true direction. Her finger tapped once on the clipboard. Dead center. The next shot hit harder. The ring carried. A second longer than the others, and someone behind them muttered, "Was that center mass?" Another shooter nearby shifted, muttering under his breath as he looked downrange, doubting his own zero. The instructor near the tower walked a few steps, forward, shading his eyes. He didn't say anything, but he stayed to watch. Travis glanced at Rachel after each shot now, not for approval, just waiting. She gave the call. He obeyed. It became routine, natural, inevitable. There was no celebration, no pause to mark how unusual it was, but those listening knew the rhythm. Of steel had changed. Her calls were the only ones consistently answered. A gust kicked up grit across the concrete. She leaned back slightly, still watching as someone 2 lanes over missed wide. His spotter swore and recalculated. They didn't get steel. Travis did. She adjusted a paper tucked behind the clipboard, flipping it once and marking something with the side of her finger. No pen, just contact between skin and paper, like she was signing her name in a language only the desert understood. Her boots were dusted now, cracked at the laces, soles worn from years of walking on ground like this. The men behind her wore imported brands that cost more than most people's cars. Their scopes gleamed under the sun like jewelry. Hers was covered with fabric stitched around the lens cap to keep it from slipping. Nothing about her said elite except the results. By the 8th shot, silence had overtaken the near side of the range. Not full silence. There were still calls, still shots, but the atmosphere had shifted like air pressure before a storm. Every man who had laughed now watched sideways, pretending not to notice while secretly calculating what they were witnessing. Some reloaded with sharper movements. One instructor spoke quietly to another near the rear tents, both nodding toward her tarp. The phrase, "perfect line," was caught in the wind and carried away like a secret. Travis looked up after his 9th hit. "You ever shoot yourself?" he asked, his voice quiet, like he knew better than to expect an answer. She didn't give one. She was already watching the wind again, seeing a shift near the rocks, a loose thread of dust curling to the right. She lifted her chin slightly. "Last shot, 1.2, light breath, send." He fired. The steel rang again, but this time it wasn't just a ring. It echoed, carried across the range, and bounced between the mesas. The sound felt different, like something finally settling into place. No one laughed. No one spoke. Rachel lowered the clipboard to her lap, her hand staying on the rangefinder, thumb resting against the adjustment knob. She didn't turn to Travis, didn't nod. The moment didn't belong to either of them. It belonged to the silence that follows perfection, and for the first time, the range flinched. The afternoon light deepened into copper, draping crimson Mesa, in long shadows that stretched like fingers across the sand. The saguaro cacti cast jagged silhouettes against the cliffs, their arms motionless in the thickening heat. Even the mirage seemed slower now, as if it too was watching. The air held less sound, conversations were shorter, laughter had vanished entirely. Travis was steady now, not confident, still too young for that, but no longer uncertain. He didn't glance around to see if anyone was watching, didn't check his math or doubt her calls. He simply loaded, breathed, and waited for her voice. 1.4, 3/4 breath, hold just low. He fired. The steel sang again at 820 meters, that tone carrying like truth across the desert floor. A group of instructors clustered. Near the tent shifted positions. One of them lowered his headset, adjusted his stance, and narrowed his eyes toward her tarp. Another stepped forward and cupped his hand over his binoculars. No one spoke to her, but their attention had locked onto lane 5 like iron filings drawn to a magnet. The previously laughing shooter at lane 7 fired wide. The target remained silent. His spotter muttered and redialed elevation, but his eyes drifted sideways toward her lane. She didn't notice, or pretended not to. Travis reset with no hesitation. "Now. Call it," he asked. She scanned the wind, watching a line of dust swirl just past the cactus at 900 meters. One flat. Hold right. Keep your shoulders loose. The next shot clipped the outer edge of steel and glanced off with a sharp ring, but it also nicked something else. A saguaro standing 10 feet to the left of the plate jerked subtly. A half-inch groove appeared along its skin where the round had skimmed, close enough to score it without doing real damage. Someone shouted from behind the line, not angry, just startled. "Did she just shave a cactus?" A few shooters looked up from their benches. The instructor near the tent lowered his clipboard. The whisper spread without sound. No one officially called it out, no one congratulated, but the space around Rachel had changed. The men near the rear started calculating based on her last wind call. One repeated it to his spotter, pretending it was his own discovery. Another lifted his scope and stared toward her, not at her gear, not at her hands, just at her. The kind of stare reserved for things you don't understand but desperately want to. Rachel's posture hadn't changed. She still sat beneath the faded tarp, one leg folded under the other, clipboard resting on her thigh. Her rangefinder stayed on its crate, untouched for the past 10 minutes. She watched the air with her eyes alone. The spotter scope beside her, wrapped in stitched canvas, remained unused. It wasn't a tool she needed. The environment itself spoke to her in a language she'd learned long ago. Travis took another shot. Hit! He didn't ask for a read anymore. He just waited. She gave one. The bullet found steel again. He wasn't the best shooter here, but under her instruction, he now had the best streak on the line. Behind them, no one mentioned his name. The sound of silence started to feel louder than the rifle cracks. Jokes had stopped. Movements were slower. Shooters took more time between rounds, listening, trying to measure what she saw. One team completely stopped shooting, waiting to catch her next correction and mirror it. They didn't ask if it was right. They assumed it was. Sergeant Cain emerged from the operations tent. He didn't speak at first, just stood beside the lead instructor, scanning the field with the methodical attention of a man who'd seen everything. Then his gaze settled on her, and he walked forward. Not fast, not angry, just curious in a way that made the air tighten around them. He stopped 3 paces behind her, watching without speaking. She sensed him, but didn't look back. 1.6. No wind call. Full breath! Send! The shot broke clean. Steel answered with authority. Cain folded his arms, his voice level when he finally spoke. Not mocking, not amazed, just even. "Where'd you learn to read like that?" She tilted her head slightly, but didn't turn. "Out where the wind has room to speak." Her reply wasn't defiant or proud, just factual. The instructor beside Cain watched her carefully, then glanced down at her notes. He saw no digital device, no telemetry screen, no ballistic software, just a range card covered in pencil marks and thumb smudges. The paper's corners were curled from heat. It was the kind of card most people threw away after one use. She'd been using it all day. He started to ask a question, then didn't. Instead, he said quietly to Cain, "She's not guessing. She's reading better than the systems." Another round hit steel. Someone down the line sighed, loud and frustrated. Travis blinked, half-smiled, then reset. He said nothing more, but his confidence was building with each perfect call. Instructors walked forward, not close enough to speak, just close enough to see. Her range position, once isolated, had become an island of stillness in a field filled with men, adjusting, second-guessing, frowning. She hadn't moved more than a few inches since mid-morning. The sun had dropped toward the canyon rim now, throwing elongated shadows from every cactus on the field. The grazed one stood among them with its new mark, like a witness to something unprecedented. The range hadn't declared anything official. No announcement had been made. But no one was calling her lucky anymore. Her voice continued, measured, exact, unshaken. The range had not crowned her, but it had simply gone quiet. And in that quiet she had already taken the lead, not by holding a weapon, but by wielding something rarer. Absolute clarity. The desert had found its voice, and it spoke through her. The sun dipped low, turning the range into a landscape of shadow and fire. Rifles cast long silhouettes across the concrete, stretching toward distant steel targets like fingers pointing at judgment. The air cooled just slightly, enough for breath to feel heavier, for dust to hang lower across the flats, undisturbed and waiting. Even the cactus arms seemed stiller now, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Sergeant Cain stepped forward and raised his voice, cutting through the quiet like a blade. "Full cease. One shot cold bore. 1,200 meters." His words sliced through the atmosphere. The men looked up from their scopes, faces tightening. Targets at that distance were almost never hit cold. Not without practice, not without full preparation. No warm-up, no spotting shot. Just one round. Hit or miss. That was the measure that separated the elite from everyone else. Travis stiffened, his face going pale. He checked the rifle's bolt, then glanced at Rachel, his mouth opening but the words refusing to come. Then, loud enough for everyone to hear, he said something that changed everything. "She should take it." A few shooters chuckled nervously. One snorted. Someone muttered, "Sure, let the poet have a turn." Another added, "Maybe she can write it a love letter while it sails wide." But Cain didn't laugh. He studied Rachel with an expression that was unreadable. No smirk, no challenge, just a quiet kind of question behind his weathered eyes. "You good for it?" he asked. Rachel didn't nod, didn't blink. She just stood. The rifle waited, propped on its bipod like an offering. She walked toward it with no ceremony, no pause. The light cut across her face, setting fire to the dust in her hair. She crouched low, checked the level, adjusted the cheek rest by a fraction, and dialed the scope 2 clicks right, 1 down. Each movement was exact. Nothing wasted. She didn't ask for wind readings. She'd already seen everything she needed to see. She didn't glance around at the other shooters who pretended to busy themselves but couldn't look away. Not this time. She went prone, and the desert settled around her like it was welcoming an old friend home. The tarp flapped once and went still. A beetle scuttled near her boot, then veered off as if even the smallest creatures knew what was coming. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger. The rifle became an extension of stillness, not threat, just perfect alignment with the moment. The scope cradled the steel plate in its crosshairs, but she didn't rush. She breathed in once, out, then again, slower. Cain watched from behind, hands folded behind his back. He said nothing, but his entire body was tense with anticipation. She pressed the trigger. The rifle cracked, the sound cutting clean through the canyon like lightning splitting stone. A dust cloud kicked up near the target, a flash of movement barely visible at this impossible range. A second passed, then another. The steel sang. It didn't ring so much as resonate, like a slow chime struck by something sacred. The sound rolled. Down the slope, across the desert floor, and into every lane behind her, announcing to the world that something extraordinary had just happened. No one spoke. No one moved. Rachel rose slowly, brushing dust from her elbow. Her face didn't change. No. Smile, no pride, just breath, and then stillness again. The other shooters stayed frozen. Some lowered their weapons, a few adjusted their scopes just for something to do with their hands. One knelt to tighten a strap that didn't need tightening. The wind picked up slightly, brushing past her like an acknowledgement from the desert itself. She stepped back, wiped her hands on her faded pants, and said nothing. Cain finally exhaled, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the range. "Hit confirmed. 1,200 meters, first round." That was all. No fanfare, no celebration. Just the facts, delivered with the weight of finality. Rachel didn't wait for applause. There was none. Not here, not in a place where truth was made of steel and silence. She returned to her crate beneath the tarp and picked up her rangefinder. Again, still warm from the sun. Her hand settled over it like it always had. The echo faded, but its weight didn't. Nobody dared to laugh. No one dared to follow. There were no congratulations, no claps on the back, just the dry wind, the long shadows, and the ringing that lingered longer than it should have. Something had shifted permanently. The range hadn't crowned her, but it had stopped testing her. There was nothing left to ask, nothing left to prove. The silence after the shot was the kind that settled in layers, reaching past the cactus groves and sliding beneath rifles, still held by men who now gripped them differently. The sound of steel ringing at 1,200 meters had faded, but its echo lingered, not in the air, but in the stillness of bodies that had stopped moving. She had spoken once with her rifle, and the desert had answered with thunder. The silence after the shot settled in layers, reaching past the cactus groves and sliding beneath the rifles still held by men who now gripped them differently. The giap, sound of steel ringing at 1,200 meters, had faded, but its echo lingered, not in the air but in the stillness of bodies that had stopped breathing. No one spoke. No one dared. Sergeant Cain lowered his clipboard slowly, as if unsure what to do with his hands. He didn't look at Rachel. Not yet. He stared instead at the target, as if trying to memorize the shape of the moment, to burn it into his memory where it would live forever. Behind him, dust lifted faintly off the ground, carried by a gentler wind than before. Up in the tower, the senior range observer began his descent. He'd been watching from the steel and glass booth all afternoon, saying nothing, recording everything. Now he stepped carefully down the metal stairs, boots clanging softly, slower with each step. The other instructors cleared a path without being asked. No one questioned why he was coming, they already knew. Rachel hadn't moved. She remained beneath the tarp, legs crossed at the ankle, rangefinder resting loosely in one hand. Her expression hadn't changed, no smile, no shift in posture. The only difference was that now no one looked past her. They looked at her, really. Looked, perhaps for the first time. The observer approached without introduction. He reached into his front pocket and removed a flat silver coin, its edges burnished smooth, the surface marked with the emblem of the Crimson Mesa Range, a symbol that had never been given to someone who hadn't earned it in blood, sweat, and impossible precision. Without speaking, he extended it toward her. She took it without ceremony. There was no nod, no handshake, just the silent exchange of one fact between two people who understood exactly what it meant. Around them, shooters began to pack. Some moved slowly, pretending to clean gear that didn't need cleaning. Others gripped their rifles tighter, waiting for someone else to speak first. A few disassembled quietly and walked off the line without a word, their pride too wounded to remain. The man at lane 3, the one who'd made the loudest jokes earlier, muttered something under his breath, wiped his scope with unnecessary force, then slung his pack and walked away without looking back. But then something unexpected happened. A senior marksman, one of the early favorites who'd missed his own 1,000-meter shot, walked past her tarp. He stopped at the edge of the concrete, knelt down, and removed his gloves, high-grade leather, creased with years of use, worth more than most people's monthly salary. He set them carefully on the edge of the dust, fingers curled slightly inward, palms up. Then he stood, looked once toward Rachel, and walked away without speaking a word. It was a gesture of respect, an acknowledgement from one shooter to another, that transcended pride, gender, or politics. In the world of precision shooting, accuracy was the only currency that mattered, and she had just demonstrated a wealth beyond measure. Cain finally stepped forward, his boots crunching against the ground with deliberate weight. He stopped just outside her tarp's shadow, his voice neutral when he spoke. New record, 1200, cold bore. Name attached is The Quiet Eye. He paused, watching her face, but she didn't react, not visibly. He nodded to himself, understanding her in a way that surprised him. That'll go on the board tonight. Behind him, the range board stood tall near the tent, a grid of etched brass and black laminate where legends were born and records lived forever. A trainee took a rag to it, clearing dust from the upper corner where space had been held open for years. No one had ever reached that number clean until now. The men who remained spoke only in glances. One shrugged at another, gesturing toward her with an open palm, then walked away before anything needed to be said. A younger cadet leaned toward an instructor and asked a question too quietly to hear. The instructor didn't answer, just followed the path of the wind with his eyes, as if trying to see what she saw. Rachel placed the coin beside her on the crate. It glinted once in the fading sun, then settled into shadow. She returned to her previous posture, hands folded loosely, gaze drifting across the range. There was nothing triumphant in her bearing, no invitation to celebrate, just the continuation of stillness that had defined her entire day. The light continued to fade. The canyon edges took on a blue hue as the sun dropped behind the ridge. Shadows grew longer, the cactus arms, once dramatic in the harsh daylight, now blurred into silhouette. One of them, just beyond the 900-meter line, still bore the shallow groove from earlier, barely visible now but undeniably real, a permanent mark left by impossible precision. Cain turned to walk away. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. His silence was agreement, and so was everyone else's. As the last shooters left, the sound of footsteps faded into the dry hush of evening. Her gear remained untouched. No one approached. No one offered congratulations, but no one dismissed her now either. The instructors spoke in low tones near the tower, beginning to discuss range formatting and rifle allocation for next season. But the tone had shifted, less rigid, less absolute. They used words like review, revisit, restructure. Change was coming, and it would start with acknowledging what they'd just witnessed. On the board, someone finished engraving the new record. The last stroke was quiet, almost reverent. The nameplate read, "The Quiet Eye, 1200 minutes, Cold Bore." It glowed faintly under the last golden light, a testament to the day when everything changed. Rachel stood as the wind picked up again. The tarp fluttered behind her. The coin remained on the crate. She didn't take it with her. It wasn't a trophy. It was acknowledgement, and acknowledgement didn't need to be carried home. She had come here as a nobody, dismissed and mocked. She was leaving as a legend, though she'd never call herself that. The steel knew her name now, and that was enough. She moved without urgency, gathering her gear quietly. The sun-bleached range card folded into the notebook she'd never needed to use, its calculations written in pencil marks that told the story of perfect reads. The rangefinder strap coiled around her hand like it belonged there, worn smooth from years of faithful service. No one stepped forward to help. No one dared interrupt this moment, but all eyes followed her movements, the way she packed the tools that had just changed their understanding of what precision really looked like. There was no salute, no word of praise, but silence had weight now, and it followed her like a shadow. Sergeant Cain approached slower than usual. His shoulders were squared, but there was something different in the way he stood. Less command, more awareness. He stopped a few paces from her, studying her face. "Name?" he asked quietly. Rachel finished zipping the canvas case, her eyes staying on the horizon where heat still shimmered like memories. "Doesn't matter," she said, her voice carrying the same calm certainty it had held all day. "Just don't make the next one wait this long to be heard." Cain watched her for a second more, then nodded. No further questions. He understood that some people didn't need their names carved in stone to leave their mark on the world. Rachel turned toward the gate, her path slow and unbroken. A single line of dust rose behind her boots, then began to fall, fading like breath. In cold air, the sun slipped behind the ridge, casting the range in bronze and blue. The cacti stretched long arms across the dirt, and her silhouette narrowed as she neared the exit. The gate clicked shut behind her with a sound like finality. Cain turned back toward the instructors, his voice carrying just enough to be heard. "That record holds?" No one argued. They couldn't. They'd all seen it, all felt the shift in the air when impossibility became reality. On the range board, beneath etched numbers and worn brass tags, the newest line read clear as the shot that made it true. "Record the Quiet Eye, 1200 millimeters, cold bore." No one spoke it aloud. It didn't have to be said. It was already done. Already. Permanent. Already legend. As darkness crept across crimson Mesa, the wind continued to blow through the saguaro cacti, whispering secrets that only some could hear. The steel targets stood silent now, but they remembered the sound of perfect precision, the ring of truth that had echoed across the desert floor. Rachel had never raised her voice. She'd never asked for permission or demanded respect, yet with every wind call, every quiet correction, she had reshaped the range around her. What began as a day of dismissal became a quiet legacy, etched not in applause but in stillness. She didn't need a title. She didn't need recognition. Her precision had spoken for her, and the world had finally listened. Miles away now, driving her weathered pickup truck down the dusty road that led away from Crimson Mesa, Rachel allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Not because she'd proven them wrong, she'd never doubted herself to begin with, but because somewhere behind her, on a range where legends were born, a new standard had been set. The desert wind followed her truck, carrying the memory of steel singing at impossible distances, of silence earned through absolute mastery, of a woman who spoke the language of precision in a world that had forgotten how to listen. And in that, wind, if you knew how to hear it, was the whisper of truth. That sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power, and the greatest victories are won not with noise, but with the kind of stillness that makes the world hold its breath. The quiet eye had left the range, but her legend would remain forever, carved in steel, measured in impossible distances, and whispered in the wind that danced between the saguaro cacti of Crimson Mesa. This story is about more than hitting a target. It's about knowing your worth even when no one else sees it. It's about choosing clarity over noise, purpose over pride, and leaving behind something unshakable without ever needing to be thanked. Rachel's quiet strength didn't demand recognition. It commanded respect through action alone. In a world full of loud voices and empty boasts, she reminded us that true power often speaks in whispers, and the most profound victories are won, not through force, but through the kind of precision that makes the impossible look effortless. Sometimes the greatest legends are written not by those who seek the spotlight, but by those who simply show up, do the work, and let their results speak for themselves. Rachel walked away from Crimson Mesa that day, but her legacy, carved in steel and measured in silence, will echo through that desert wind forever. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment. Below, we love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.